I would like to welcome you to this, one of the plethora of events at the new, improved Heman Sweat Civil Rights Symposium. And this symposium was created by a very democratic committee in which people defended their ideas and, by and large, got their ideas implemented. And the reason for which the symposium is a week instead of 2 days is that we had so many people with so many ideas. And since we were talking about representations, we wanted to get everybody in who had something of significance to say about the issue of representing blackness, past, present, and future. And as a result, one of the people on the committee said, somebody we have to have is Michael Parenti. And others of us said, well, all right, justify that, because everybody had to justify why we had to have everybody we had to have. And some people aren't here, and some people are here. We had what we wanted to do would have taken a good month, but we didn't have a month. We figured that we could stretch 2 days into a week, but it would be really difficult to stretch 2 days into an entire month.
Dr. Sheila S. Walker, Director, UT Austin Center for African and African American Studies. This past spring, the University of Texas at Austin held its 8th annual Heman Sweat Symposium on Civil Rights. The symposium, originally focused on civil rights in this country, but now addresses the broader issues of the African American struggle for freedom and equality around the world. This year's symposium was entitled Images of Blackness, Past, Present, and Future. The symposium explored the negative images of African Americans from the past, as well as those that persist into the present and threaten the future. Also, the week-long series of speakers, films, and panels focused on what can be considered one of the most basic civil and human rights, the right of a people to construct and promote their own self-images. I'm Johnny L. Hanson, Jr., and welcome to another edition of In Black America. This week, the 8th annual Heman Sweat Symposium on Civil Rights, Black Images in White Media with Dr. Michael Parenti in Black America.
The major studios in Hollywood are beholden to the top New York banks. As early as 1930, Hollywood was under the financial control of the Morgans and the Rockefellers. The major networks are not close to corporate America. They're not friendly to corporate America. They are corporate America. CBS is a multinational corporation owned outright by capital cities. NBC is owned by General Electric, and GE is probably one of the most conservative corporations in the world. Actively politically conservative. They brought Ronald Reagan up from his faltering career, made him host of General Electric Theater, and then boosted him for governor of California and launched him on his way to the White House. Fox Network is owned by a right-wing Australian named Rupert Murdoch, who, when asked if he was a conservative, said no, he's a radical conservative, meaning really extreme. The boards of directors of the networks and the majors in Hollywood are inhabited by corporate representatives from ITT, General Motors, PepsiCo, Ford, J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan, etc. So they resemble all other corporations in their corporate interlocking directorates.
In 1949, a little-known postal worker named Heman M. Sweat applied for admission to the law school at the University of Texas at Austin, but was denied on the basis of race. A team of NAACP lawyers, led by the late Thurgood Marshall, represented Mr. Sweat in a lawsuit that ultimately reached the U.S. Supreme Court. As a result of the decision in favor of Mr. Sweat, he was admitted to the University of Texas Law School in 1950. Since the 1910s, each generation of African Americans has been challenged to compete for control of the black image in all media. In this struggle, African Americans face a powerful industry with a demonstrated ability to rewrite this country's history. At this year's symposium, Images of Blackness, Past, Present, and Future, the issue of how a group will be represented and who will control the representation has become more important to African Americans as it has become clear that the ability to control perception of identity is real power. Dr. Michael Parenti was one of this year's speakers. Dr. Parenti holds a Ph.D. in political science from Yale University. He has taught at a number of universities around the world and in this country, and is the author of 9 books. Dr. Parenti spoke on the portrayal of blacks in mainstream entertainment, news, and other media.
These aren't people who are exactly at the cutting edge of the problems of the black masses. I mean, as far as having any sense or sensitivity to that. Another power in the major media are the advertisers in television. The single biggest advertiser is Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble has a fascinating code, which I recommend all of you to read it someday, what they will allow or not allow in the shows that they sponsor. And they'll have a lot of things. Nothing disrespectful toward the military. The business community can never be portrayed as heartless or cold or lacking in human feelings. No American values or institutions can be attacked unless they're completely rebutted in the same program. No American values or institutions can be attacked. Well, how do you deal with racism, with this kind of stricture? Liggett and Myers, they've admitted we pre-censor all our shows and we rule out anything excessively controversial. Well, how do you deal with the issues of racism if you rule out things that are controversial? Turning to black images in the white media, as you can see today with the hysteria about a crime control bill, one of the most frequent black images in the media relates to crime. African Americans, Latinos, and other minorities are more likely to be publicized as criminals than the corporate leaders whose crimes are frequently more serious and of wider scope and repercussion than the street criminals. I mean that, by the way. In terms of actual money that costs the public, corporate crime costs more than street crime. In terms of actual number of lives taken, corporate crime, with the toxic waste dumps, the deformed births, the death, disease, the violations of occupational safety, the unsafe products, and a host of other kinds of things that they've done which lead to incredible numbers of deaths, are worse criminals than the street criminal. The trouble is most Americans don't know that. That doesn't get represented in the media. They don't see that on TV. You don't see the crime in the suites. You see repeated representations of crime in the streets. Drug crimes. Well, whether it's marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, or even crack, I was astonished to find, drug use is significantly higher among young white males than among young African American males in the real society, according to a 1992 report by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. However, a survey of the media itself, let me get back a bit. USA Today, the survey shows 15% of drug users are African Americans. African Americans are, estimates vary from 12 to 14% of the population, depending on how much you want to trust the census count. But the Black Entertainment Network reports, a content analysis they did, that 50% of network news stories on drugs focus on African Americans. So the black drug problem is in part a white media black drug problem. The news media do not have much to say about the struggles of African Americans, Latinos, and other ethnic groups for jobs, decent housing, safe neighborhoods. Those struggles usually are not portrayed. Likewise, the struggles of people of color to gain recognition in art, literature, entertainment, music, education, sports, religion, labor, etc., have earned relatively scant notice in the news media. The African American candidate who attracts millions of votes in presidential primaries while taking a progressive stance on issues is likely to win very unsympathetic treatment, as did Jesse Jackson in 1984 and again in 1988. Jackson was designated the black candidate, as if his only appeal was to black voters, even though he did very well in predominantly white states like Vermont and Oregon. Although Jackson's financial status is far more modest than most of the other presidential candidates, almost all of whom are millionaires. In fact, all of them were millionaires in 1992 and in 1988. He also made less than 1/10 or 1/20 of what the average TV anchor person makes. Nevertheless, there was an issue, the press raised questions about his large salary. Despite his constant attention to issues, he was said to be on a self-serving ego trip. And one thing about Jesse Jackson, I found he was about the only candidate who wasn't on an ego trip. That is, what the average political candidate does is use the issues to boost himself. And what Jesse kept doing was using himself to push the issues. If you go back and read Aristotle's Rhetoric, he'll talk about the really effective speaker is the one who does not make the issue an instrument for him, but makes himself an instrument of the issue. And that's what Jesse did so brilliantly, which is why we could believe him and listen to him and be inspired by him. Yet they would talk about his ego trip. And also because he argued that U.S. interventions abroad did not serve the interests of the people of the Third World, nor the interests of the American people, he was labeled a Third World radical. That was a term used again and again for him. So that's an example of how a black candidate is treated in the news media. Another candidate, the erstwhile mayor of Gary, Indiana, Richard Hatcher. Richard Hatcher was he was the best, the most honest, the most progressive mayor that Gary, Indiana ever had, and he administered the city for 20 years. Hatcher commented on the hostile and distorted coverage accorded him by the press in his city. By the way, it wasn't only because he was an African American, it was also because he was that other really dangerous component. There's certain African Americans they'll bring along. Hatcher, quote, "I was the first black mayor of this city, and they've never forgiven me for that." After he was reelected for a fifth term with 90% of the vote. I mean, what mayor gets elected with 90% of the vote? The Gary Post-Tribune, owned by a rich conservative, still saw fit to remark that, quote, "there is no consensus among the voters in support of Hatcher." When a University of Chicago study rated Gary, Indiana, the first among 62 cities in regard to fiscal policy and administration, the local media in Gary never even reported the fact. As media commentators, African Americans remain drastically underrepresented. You'll see a lot of African Americans as local news announcers. Local shows, almost every evening news, there'll be. But I'm talking about commentators, those who actually give opinions and do editorials and the like. Mayor Hatcher again, quote, "About the only time you really see blacks giving their opinions or given any serious space is when it relates to minorities or civil rights. That seems to be the only time the media feel we are competent enough to express opinions." By the way, even in that area, blacks who express ideas on race will run counter to the predominant ideological mode are likely to be subject to attack. Reputable African-American scholars and educators have tried to move away from a Eurocentric approach, for instance, in history and social sciences, and to treat often neglected, suppressed African and African-American histories and themes, and these efforts have been vehemently denounced in the white media as, quote, bad history and, quote, ethnic cheerleading. Let me turn to entertainment. In an average TV series, of the 60 or 70 major performers in every new season, relatively few are African Americans. It took the television industry over 40 years before it could get around to featuring African American talk show hosts, such as Oprah Winfrey, Arsenio Hall, and the like. On the production side, not more than 3% of the people working behind the cameras are African American. As of 1990, there were no major black executives or agents in the movie or television industries. In 1988, Hollywood's two top-ranking African American executives lost their jobs. The same underrepresentation prevails in the news sector. One survey by the American Society of Newspaper Editors found that people of color compose less than 6% of the journalists employed, and a good number of whom work for African American publications. When you look at movies, I'd like to give you a little historical overview of movies because I kind of was raised on these movies, and you think that white males of my age, not of my class though, but of my age, were fed these kind of images, and maybe haven't taken the time to critically re-examine them, the first years of the movie industry, what we call the silent film era, were openly racist. The movies had titles like, in 1904, a silent film called The Wooing and Wedding of a Coon. That was the title of the movie, right up there on the marquee. 1914, Coontown Suffragettes. 1915, The Nigger. No, there wasn't any ambiguity here. So whether he was called Sambo or Rastus, whether played by blacks or black-faced whites, the cinematic African-American male was usually a simple-minded buffoon, lazy, shiftless, but rhythmic. The black female was what was called in those days a handkerchief head, Aunt Jemima in the kitchen, cook, good-natured, hearty. There was one black actor named Lincoln Perry who so encapsulated the shuffling, childish slouch that the character he played actually became his Hollywood name, Stepin Fetchit. And when he played in movies, he was not on the credits. He was not listed as Lincoln Perry. He was listed as Stepin Fetchit, and he was a stock character. I remember when I was a kid, if I lounged around as I used to like to do, and all that, and was a little slow on the step, I remember my mother saying, "Hey, Stepin Fetchit, come on, will you move? Come on, let's go, Stepin Fetchit." And I wondered who this Stepin Fetchit was, and it turns out Lincoln Perry, by the way, himself was a very intelligent, cultivated man. He played this character. That was the only kind of job a black actor could get in the 1920s. In the 1930s, you had a very interesting development. African Americans started producing their own movie industry. There was a whole African American movie industry with scripts and films made up totally of African American actors in a total African American world. And these played in theaters in black communities and such. But they really failed to draw the great majority of African American moviegoers away from, the mainstream Hollywood stuff with its slicker glitter and its higher price produced shows. Most of them just wouldn't take a fantasy of black power that many found implausible given the society they were living in those days. Also, these films were small, underfinanced, poorly distributed, and so they didn't survive. In the 1940s, a lot of campaigns. By the way, all through these years, there were Negro organizations, as they were called then, others that fought against this racism and the stereotype. And by the 1940s, organizations like the NAACP, the African American Press, and certain show business groups really made concerted efforts against the racist stereotypes that were in the movies. By the mid-40s, they got the federal government on their side because we were then in what was called World War II. I remember it as a kid. I remember you used to see those big posters up. Black and white together, we're all Americans fighting Hitler, Kill the dirty Japs, Then you have have the Oriental racist thing, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, we're all Americans. This whole propaganda started coming. The emphasis was on unity of the American people to fight this war and win World War II. It's about the only positive spin-off from World War II, that and the destruction of Nazism, but the temporary destruction of Nazism. So there was a propagation of a lot of racial and religious equality, these ideas. And the Sambo roles were eliminated. Stepin Fetchit went out of style. The trouble was there weren't any new roles to take their place, and many black Americans were out of jobs. When they did appear in movies, it was stock characters, porters, singers, dancers, and domestics. And as I remember an interview of an African-American performer, I forget his name, but it was in one of the Marlon Riggs great documentaries where he said, it's okay to have us portrayed as singers and dancers. We're great singers and dancers, but the trouble was not to only have those roles and be confined to those roles. In the late 50s, there was a great African-American performer. I know a lot of you young people never saw him, but I hope you remember and know his name, Nat King Cole. And he was the first to get a television show as the host of a major television show on NBC. And it didn't last because they couldn't get advertisers for it. The the corporate advertisers would not risk sponsoring a show hosted by a black person. The 1950s also gave us, 1950s when television came in as a mass consumption commodity. The late 1940s, early 50s, that's when TV took over the world. To those of you who thought TV has been here since George Washington's day, it's not true. It came in the 50s. There was life before TV. We used to do a lot of things like talk to each other and, go out once in a while and stuff. The 50s also brought a television series called Amos and Andy, which had been on the radio already for 20 years, originally created by two white men, and now with an all-black cast, and again with the same stereotypes. Every character was as the black doctors appeared as quacks, the black lawyers as slippery shysters, and the like. The African-American women were usually shown as bossy shrews who had to hector their irresponsible, evasive men. And so it went all through the 50s. Bueller, the Jack Benny Show, the Charlie Chan movies, which you can still see on TV. Actually, the Charlie Chan movie started in the 40s. The faithful sidekick in Casablanca. Remember, Sam played against Sam. Everybody called Humphrey Bogart Rick, but Sam called him Mr. Richard, who had no life, no needs, no longing of his own, but just was a faithful adjunct to his boss. The Gunga Din, the Tonto character, which is so common. Black people had no no identity except as adjuncts to the white principals, white leads. The African-American actress and writer Ellen Holly noted, quote, "I grew up bombarded with movies that depicted black women almost exclusively as maids or sluts of limited intelligence." Now, if you want to play devil's advocate, you could argue, well, being a domestic was the major occupational opportunity for black women, so many maids were black, so maybe the movies were really just offering a faithful representation of an unfortunate reality. But Holly's complaint is really something else. She's saying that African-American women are not portrayed as human beings. Be they maids or prostitutes, their real stories are never told. As she goes on to say, quote, "The irony, of course, is that Hollywood has yet to make a movie that actually deals with a black maid. I have come to recognize the female black domestic as perhaps the great heroine of the black race, because that lady was willing to get down on her knees and scrub another woman's floor, clean another woman's house, and bring up another woman's children. A whole race survived. But the trauma and the paradox of having to leave your own children in the morning and go out and care for someone else's in order to bring back bread for their table in the evening has yet to be examined on film." By the 1950s and the 1960s, African Americans were militantly mobilizing against oppressive conditions in the South and in the North. It was the age of the Freedom Riders, demonstrating in the streets, organized sit-ins, boycotts. I remember getting training myself. Was it the Congress on Racial Equality? Yes. We used to go to workshops. We used to sit nonviolent workshops, and someone would hit you on the side of the head with rolled up newspapers, and you weren't supposed to lose your temper. It was quite a training for me. I'm an Italian-American kid from East Harlem, and I'd sit there, and they'd, no. And we'd have to sit there, and we'd do all this stuff, and so we can go on sit-ins. And I remember when we walked on the picket lines in New York, this was against the House of Detention and trying to fight racism. Well, most of the women in the House of Detention were black. We got a bunch of kids, little kids with pea shooters, and they didn't train me in the non-violent lab about pea shooters. So it was really it was the most excruciating demonstration I've ever been on. I've been beaten up by police with club and all that, and these little kids kept coming and hitting us with these peas, and I just could feel, my rockets almost going off and walking, and just wanting to wring their little necks, but I didn't. This was a great awakening for a lot of people, African American, white, Latino, all sorts of people. The catalyst being the black struggle. It was a period of heroic struggle. I wasn't one of the heroes. I'm talking about the people who went down in the South then, the Freedom Riders and all. It was a period of sacrifice, which looking back now, we still could read about it with wonderment or hear about it. I mean, I know people who were on the freedom rides, students of mine went. They faced violence and murder by racists. They faced the complicity of the FBI agents, of the police, with a courage that was stupendous. I mean, there was 1,000 dramas that were created in those days. Millions of people were affected, and there were scores and scores of tragedies, of murders and beatings and whatever else. And at that time, Hollywood and television managed to overlook the entire thing. I mean, here's the whole thing is going on in the country, and there was not one hint of it in Hollywood or television. A proud and dramatic page of history was considered not worth dramatic, not having any dramatic merit to it. What Hollywood did get around to in those days was to finally present black lead actors. It was generally an actor who was a saint, clean-cut, infinitely patient, embodied. One particular actor who played that role was Sidney Poitier. He was it. I mean, Sidney Poitier was Saint Sidney, and in movie after movie, he's up there, blessed with limitless supplies of patience, integrity, self-control, never stooping to the level of his adversaries, which was to his credit, but still, you know, every so often you wondered, you say, Sidney, bust them one. A clean-cut, middle-class African-American saint who would not threaten white audiences with any expression of black anger. That was the whole role. He wasn't supposed to have any anger of his own that would be a threat to the white audience. Eventually, by the 1970s, we got to the black superheroes, who really, unfortunately, were replicas of the white macho idiocy. Sweet Sweetback, Shaft, Shaft's Big Score, Superfly. These were the titles of movies. You can get an idea of black males now could be aggressive, violent, ruthless, powerful, and able to outsmart, outtalk, outfight, outfornicate their white adversaries.
Dr. Michael Parenti, speaking at the 8th Annual Human Sweat Symposium on Civil Rights. If you have a question or comment or suggestions as to future In Black America programs, write us. Also, let us know what radio station you heard us over. Views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station or the University of Texas at Austin. Until we have the opportunity again for IBA technical producer David Alvarez, I'm John L. Hanson, Jr. Thank you for joining us this week, and join us again next time.